great. Chairman Ed Stevenson, Reverend Garcia, Governor Askew, Mayor Clark, my good friend Charlie Harris, the fraternal delegates from Great Britain and Canada, members of the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO, delegates to this convention, ladies and gentlemen. On your behalf, I want to express my deep appreciation to Ed Stevenson, to Governor Askew, Mayor Clark, Charlie Harris, for the very wonderful welcome they've given us here this morning. I'm sure that I can say on your behalf that we're very happy to be back in Miami and look forward to a useful and constructive stay here. A great deal has happened since our last convention in Atlantic City, the early days of October 1969. At that time, we were much concerned with the attempt of the President to put a racist on the United States Supreme Court, an attempt that was repeated a few months later. And I can tell you that I'm proud beyond words of the part that the AFL-CIO played in bringing about the rejection of Mr. Coswell and Mr. Hainsworth for that great honor. At our last convention, and same as today, we were very much concerned with the health, the economic health of the nation. We were then in the 8th month of President Nixon's and Dr. Arthur Burns' economic game plan number 1. At our convention, we pointed out that the restrictive finance, fiscal, and monetary policies of the administration, tightening up on the money supply, creating high interest rates, had boosted unemployment and reduced home building to a shadow. We pointed out that the 8.5% prime rate that banks were then charging their most favored customers was a major inflationary item in itself. And keep in mind that the main purpose of the economic game plan number 1 which was inaugurated in February 1969, was the same as the stated purpose of the present plan, to fight inflation. And recall also that in February '59, President Nixon promised the American workers in writing that he was going to bring down prices, and these are his words, without causing the workers to pay for it through increased unemployment. At the time of our convention in '69, the results were crystal clear, and it was quite obvious that there was more to come. The cost of living had gone up and up. There was a widespread increase in unemployment, causing suffering to millions of workers. Small business was badly hurt by the high interest rate. 10% mortgage money for the purchase of homes was commonplace. And it was obvious to all that economic game plan number 1 was a complete, miserable failure. What did the president say then? He said the plan was working. Success was just around the corner. And he continued to say this month in and month out until August of 71. Yes, we heard him say 71's going to be a good year and 72 is going to be a better year. And there's going to be no change in the economic game plan of the president. This plan, as you know, was the brainchild of Dr. Arthur Burns. And he gave an indication in January of 1971 of what we now are experiencing. Like all bureaucrats, when failure looms, they look for a scapegoat. And in an address in California, a little college called Pepperdine College in January of this year, Arthur Burns spoke about the economy. He didn't apologize for the failure of economic game plan number one, nor did he attempt to explain that failure. He just turned his attention on labor and say our problems come because of the high wages demanded by the workers of this country. And this from a fellow who was the architect of two recessions during the Eisenhower years, and who was the architect of the Nixon recession of 1970, 69, 70, and 71, and is the architect that is leading us in to the first year of the Nixon Depression of 1971-72. Well, what happened to Arthur? You know, if he was working in the USSR, he'd have been sent to Siberia. But no, he got promoted. He's now chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, where he can do a whole lot more mischief. So this is where we were. And then came the big flip-flop. Positively no controls to a wage price freeze. Again, no apology from the president, no explanation, no mea culpa, nothing like that. It just didn't happen. It reminds you of the years in the Soviet Union, the 20s and 30s, where they had the 5-year plan to bring more consumer goods to their people, to make life a little bit better. And of course, you know, they rewrite history, those people. They even rewrite the arithmetic tables. They had five-year plans in 10 years. So now we've got a new plan to curb inflation after 2.5 years of failure. Of course, in the Soviet Union, nobody dares ask what happened to the old one. But this is America, and we want to know what happened to the old one. So on August 15th, the president put on one of his usual scintillating performances, a very, very beautiful act. The market went up. He inaugurated Nixon's new prosperity. He didn't explain what the hell was wrong with the old prosperity, because when he came in, we only had 3% unemployment. We now have 6 and 2,200,000 people more unemployed. Yes, the market went up and then it went down. Reminds me of the story of the farmer went in town to hear a new minister preach and came back and told the neighbors, he said, oh, what a beautiful sermon, he says. This man is terrific, he's wonderful. The neighbor said, well, what did he talk about? And the farmer hesitated, he says, you know, he didn't say. So that's what happens to the market. It goes up, you know. His performance is terrific. It goes up. And then they say, well, what did he say? And then it goes down. Well, the president talked that night about equity. And, you know, we had told the president time and time again that we would cooperate in any program to meet these economic problems that was equitable. And it's a very simple thing. What equity? It's described as the quality of being equal and fair in any and all circumstances. So on the 15th of August, the president proposed a program. And we got looking at that program, and very frankly, we were looking for equity. And what we found was rank discrimination against those in the lower economic circumstances in favor of big business. Just as simple as that. The proposed wage freeze was very simple to enforce. Every employer was an enforcer, happy to be an enforcer. The price freeze, no plans for that except Internal Revenue Service, and they enforced it over the telephone. In fact, after the freeze was on a month, the New York office of the IRS reported they got 38 telephone calls in one day, and that they disposed of them by 38 outgoing calls. But when we looked at this program, we seen a $3 billion investment tax credit for business. And this was on top of $4 billion he gave him in May of 1971, retroactive to January. Retroactive, remember that. Retroactive to January of 1971, accelerated write-offs, which amounted to $4 billion. But of course, he had a plan. He had a plan to balance off this $3 billion he was giving him an investment tax credit. And he done quite well. In fact, he made money on this deficit, according to his own figuring. He took $1.3 billion out of the pockets of the federal employees. And they're here and they can tell you about it. He took away a raise that he had given them under the comparability law from January 1, 1972 to June of 1972. $1.3 billion. And then he postponed his welfare reform program, which was his #1 domestic program. He postponed it and therefore saved another $1.1 billion. And then he cut back on his revenue sharing plans to the tune of another $1 billion, and then he provided for layoffs of federal employees, which would save him $500 million. So here it is. Robbing the poor, starving the cities, that his heart was bleeding for the cities early in the year. And welfare reform had to be done, something had to be done. Oh no, he put that on the back burner, put the revenue sharing, because he had to find $3 billion for big business. And make no mistake about it, this is this man's innate philosophy. Whatever philosophy he has is based on the idea that if you make the fat cats a little fatter, somewhere along the line, the poor simpletons are going to profit by it. His slogan is profits, profits, profits. Well, on the 18th of August, the Executive Council met, and we looked at the President's program, and we stated very simply, with a great deal of finesse, that we have absolutely no faith in the ability of President Nixon to successfully manage the economy of the nation. Despite this obviously inequitable nature of the President's so-called wage price freeze, we again said that we would cooperate with a fair and equitable program for the period following the freeze. And shortly after August 18th, a group of labor representatives, members of the Productivity Council, were invited to the White House to see the President, Mr. Connally, Mr. Schultz, Mr. McCracken, Dr. Burns, Dr. Stein, Hudson, and all of these other fellows who make a career of managing other people's lives. And in response to the President's desire for what he called some kind of fair mechanism to curb inflation without rigid price control or government controls, we told him that we would suggest the establishment of an independent, voluntary agency free from government control of a tripartite nature similar to the War Labor Board of World War II. We told them very simply that we would not accept government control under the camouflage of an agency that pretended to be voluntary and independent. And we urged him to study the history of the War Labor Board, the tripartite setup, and also a similar setup that was in existence for a short time during the Korean conflict. In the meantime, he created what was known as the Cost of Living Council under the chairmanship of Big John, from the big oil man from Texas. And they continued to hand down decisions restricting every type of activity of workers and their unions. While prices were being controlled by the IRS over the telephone, we were getting new rulings every day from the Cost of Living Council. And the hatchet man there is a fellow by the name of Weber, John Connolly's assistant. And he made all sorts of rulings. Oh, some of them were contradictory, but there were none of them friendly, I'll tell you that. He said we couldn't get our money that was due to us under our contracts during the freeze. He said we could not negotiate for it after the freeze. Just think of that. He was not only going to control it during the freeze, he was going to tell us what we could do after the freeze, that we couldn't negotiate for it. He made 7 or 8 rulings on the teachers, and we kept a little box score on them. It was no, 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 yes, maybe, no, yes, no. And I don't think he knows yet what those rulings were. So then came the birth of Phase 2. Obstetricians, I think, would refer to it as a breech presentation. And surely it was a case of confusion confounded. October 5th came a bearer of good news, Brother Hudson. The President had agreed to our plan for an independent, voluntary agency. They wanted 5, 5, and 5. 5 industry, 5 labor, and 5 public. They specified that 2 of the 5 labor, 1 would be Teamster, 1 would be auto. I said, fine, that's okay with me. I said, Jim, would you put this in the form of a memo? Because I'd like to get these fellas together and let them see what this is. I think it's all right. So he said, yes, he'd do that. And then he said, when are you going to get them together? I said, well, I'll let you know. And I called up Leonard Woodcock. I called up Fitzsimmons of the Teamsters. Called up Abel of the Steelworkers and Red Smith of the Machinists. And I arranged for a breakfast meeting on the morning of October 7th. That's the day that the President made the announcement over the telephone. And that was quite a day. On the morning of October 7th, we met, and Jim Hudson brought over his memo and distributed. This was a setup, and we read it very carefully. There was a few words there that bothered us, and we said, Jim, does this mean the pay board's got to be? No. Well, how about that word review? Don't mean anything. Well, can they veto the standards? Oh, no. He was very convincing. He reminded me of a little league empire I see around the neighborhood He makes every decision with the same gestures. Trouble is, you can't tell whether the runner's safe or out. Well, that was very good. We were convinced. Then we were invited over to the White House, the meeting of the Productivity Council, and we listened to Mr. Schultz. And he gave us no cause for believing that Mr. Hodgson was wrong. And we came back to the AFL-CIO office, the five of us, and we drew up a short statement in which we said that under these conditions we would cooperate and try to make the president's plan work. Then the radio and the TV and the newspapers started to come out. And they all contained the same language. Cost of Living Council, veto power over the so-called pay board. So this causes some difficulty. We waited for the president's speech, and we decided that we would not issue this statement. We had to get more clarification. We talked to Schultz the next morning, tried desperately to get him to say do or do they not have a veto power. And of course, we thought we were talking to the head man, but we found out we weren't. He'd evidently been demoted. And he advised us to listen to Secretary Connolly's TV show on Friday, the 8th of October, that we'd get some information there. We told Schultz, of course, that we were not going to be used to provide a front or a facade for an agency that really was not voluntary, that it was under government control. We were assured that Connolly would clear it all up. So we watched the press conference, and three times during that conference, Mr. Connolly was asked point blank to clear up the question about the Cost of Living Council's veto power over standards set by the pay board. Of course, bear in mind that the regulation could say the Cost of Living Council would not veto decisions of the pay board, and that would be meaningless if the Cost of Living Council would set up the standards. In other words, that would mean that the pay board would operate within certain limitations set by the Cost of Living Council, so there'd be absolutely no need for the Cost of Living Council to veto. But Mr. Connolly did not clarify and did not answer the question. So then I called a meeting of the Executive Council for Tuesday morning, October the 12th. And I invited the president of the Teamsters and the president of the auto workers to come, and they attended. Late in the evening of October 11th at home, I got a call from someone on Hodgson's staff, asked if I would be available to meet him and Mr. Schultz early in the morning. So I met them early in the morning, my office, and they had a new memorandum from the president. And this one had the president's signature on it. Not his signature, just his initials, RN. And it said, the Cost of Living Council, this is one of the sections, will not approve, disapprove, or serve as an appeal level for case decisions made by the pay board and price commission. It will not approve, revise, veto, or revoke specific standards or criteria developed by the pay board and the price commission. Well, this was quite definite, and it had the initials on it, and I guess they knew damn well I wouldn't take anything from them after what I'd been through. So they brought the initials. So we made a very simple decision. We will try to help the president's mechanism, to make the president's mechanism to control the cost of living work. We will serve on the pay board. We will establish our own watchdog units to monitor prices. We will continue to oppose the president's tax measures in the Congress, and we will continue our fight for full employment, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I got a telephone call of appreciation from the president that afternoon. And boy, I should have known better. That should have really made me suspicious, but Then on Saturday night, I got a call from Jim Hodgson. Now they're getting ready for set up the pay board. I was out having dinner, and I got a call. One of the reporters happened to be talking to me at the table. He's here today, so he can verify I did get the call. And it came from the White House. You know, this business of the cabinet people, they use the White House, and it's very, 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 very impressive. You know, somebody comes up and phone, Mr. Meany, White House calling, you know. And you think you're going to get the president, you wind up with Hudson, you know. So he asked me if I knew a judge by the name of Bolt out in the state of Washington. I said no. He said, well, try to get some information on him. He's being considered for chairman of the pay board. I said, well, I'll see what I can do. I said, I'll get back to you maybe by Tuesday. I said, I'm not going to get any information on Sunday. And so if I knew what I knew now, I would have sent a glowing letter recommending that fella in the highest terms. And then he'd have surely been turned down. But on Tuesday morning, Jim called me, and he says, you know that fella Bolt? I said, yeah. He says, forget him. He said something, he said a rather odd thing. He said he'd be long gone in a short time. I don't know just where that expression comes from. He said he'd be long gone in a short time. He's totally and completely unfit for this job. He has absolutely no experience in this field, and he just couldn't handle it at all. He knows nothing about it. Well, I said, well, that's the end of Bolt. Thursday night, I was informed by Hudson that Bolt was going to be chairman. I said, what the hell are you talking about, Jim? He's going to be chairman. He said, well, after your description, he said, well, he says there's some people around here don't agree with my estimation of his ability. And besides, we couldn't get anybody else. So now this is the chairman of the pay board, supposed to be composed of 5 representatives of employers, 5 representatives of labor, and 5 people representing the public who are neutral as to labor and management, and who, under no circumstances, are supposed to represent the government. Well, the judge is on the federal payroll, and he certainly is neutral in the sense that he doesn't know a damn thing about labor and management. But he has someone right at his elbow who takes care of him and answers all the questions. We were there for 10 days with this guy, and he answered no question. Every time we asked him a question, in come Mr. Weber. So Mr. Weber is the second public member of the pay board. He's been on the government payroll since January of 1969, and he was on the government payroll to the night of October 21st. And on October 22nd, he became a public member of this board. He's the fellow that wrote all those nice things that the Cost of Living Council got out. He's the hatchet man. He's the fellow who's been doing all the dirt he could do. So he is on as a public member of the pay board. Then we move on to a gentleman, and quite a nice man, by the name of Caples. His whole life has been spent in industry. Executive Vice President of Inland Steel Company. Entire career spent on management side of labor management relations. A former Vice President of the National Association of Manufacturers. The last 2 years, however, he's president of Kenyon College. He's retired from his business life. Now, this would be like taking one of our old-timers who spent his whole life on the labor side and give him a title, emeritus, and say, well, now he's neutral. He can be a public member. This is Mr. William Caples. And as I say, I have no quarrel with these people, except that they are in the wrong spot and they do not represent the public. And they certainly provide an unbalanced board. Then we have Mr. Mr. Clement Gordon, who was from Brookings Institute and one-time director of the budget. And then we have Dr. Neil Jacoby, a conservative economist from the West Coast, member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Arthur Burns in the Eisenhower administration, and he helped Arthur fashion those two recessions that we had in those days. For the past 12 years and up to the present moment, a director of the Occidental Petroleum Company. How's that for a neutral? On the 27th of October, according to the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Jacoby said there was no need to control profits. Its profits were not income to begin with. And there'd be no need to control prices. Just keep wages down, and that will take care of profits and prices. So there's your public members of your pay board. And of course, it adds up to a stacked deck. It adds up to playing with loaded dice, just as simple as that. There's no hope, or very little hope, for equity. But we undertook to keep our promise to try to make this program work. And the pay board had its first formal meeting, I think October 28th. And boy, I discovered within 2 minutes that Hudson was right. And we discussed organizational matters, and we adjourned in about an hour. And then we met the next morning, and we again discussed organizational matters. And then we adjourned for 4 or 5 days, and November 2nd, in order that the government statistics could come up with some economic facts that we might need. Now, they came up with some facts. Specifically, we wanted some information on the number of contracts, the number of people adversely affected by the freeze, the size of deferred increases, either in percentage and dollars, and so on and so forth. Well, they come up with some statistics, but only on large contracts. They gave us no information on small contracts at all. It was all the big stuff, and we never got the information on the small contracts. And, of course, I want to point out that while there are hundreds of thousands of people that are parties to large contracts represented by large unions, there are millions of people that are represented and that work in small shops of 100, 200, 300 people. And as far as the AFL-CIO is concerned, they're all equal. There's no difference as far as we're concerned. Then there came 4 days of complete frustration. And I want to tell you, I've been around a long time. I don't have to tell you that. You read that in the paper. But I've been around a long time, and I'm telling you, in all my experience, have I ever went through a more frustrating, debasing experience, I would say. And I've been insulted by experts in my time. The employers section was run by Mr. Roger Blau. He wasn't the spokesman, but he was running the show. And I have a suspicion he was running the public group, too. Now, this is the fellow who was chairman of the board, president of the United States Steel Corporation, who in 1962 was accused of double-crossing the President of the United States, of double-crossing the Steel Workers Union, and of double-crossing the steel industry official who negotiated with the Steel Workers Union. They signed what was supposed to be a non-inflationary contract. It was sold to the union on the basis of being a non-inflationary contract, and as soon as the union ratified it, Mr. Blau went off with his so-called Price Committee of U.S. Steel, and he raised prices. So this is the fellow who's now retired, but he has a labor of love. He has a large staff in Washington, and he's been working on this with conjunction with the NAM. He's well supplied with money, and he runs an organization that's dedicated to bring wages down. That's the purpose of his organization, to keep wages down and bring them down. In other words, he has the philosophy that the future of this country can best be served by a low-wage economy. So he's the fellow that was over here running this show. Oh, there was a pipsqueak by the name of Dave from General Electric who was his mouthpiece, but Blau was the boy. Well, to give you an idea what we went through, we adjourned a Friday evening, week ago, last Friday, and we were to meet at 11 a.m., and this is the minutes. Oh, and the minutes are something to really see. We were to meet at 11 a.m., and they had delayed us all week, calling for caucuses and conferences, and we never got to a vote. We kept asking for a vote, and the old judge says, no, I've got to study these things. I don't agree with, he said one day, I don't agree with the labor proposal, I don't agree with the industry proposal, and he was asked he would please tell us what he didn't agree with in our proposal or even the industry proposal, and he said no, under no circumstances would he divulge his disagreement. So we were to meet. We adjourned Friday night, somewhere around 6 o'clock. We would meet at 11 a.m. And we were asked to have a caucus with the employers at 10 o'clock. And there was no caucus. The employers were coming in with new proposals that we had never seen before. They brought in one proposal, submitted it one day, and after we read it all over and said, well, is this your proposal? No. This is the one we've been working on, but we're in disagreement among ourselves. Now, what the hell, they brought us a proposal? They were disagreeing among themselves. But anyway, we were to meet, and the minutes show this. They don't show much, but they at least show this, that we meet at 11 a.m. Well, we're sitting in this room, all the labor members and our people working with us there, and the old judge stuck his nose in the door about 11:15. He says, if you need me, I'll be around. Then he and the industry members went to lunch, and they didn't even tell us they were going to lunch. And we didn't see the judge again until 4 o'clock that afternoon. We just sat in this room. And this was deliberate. This was deliberate. I think they were trying to goad us into walking out. At least I got that impression. Because when they finally got to the meeting at 4 o'clock that afternoon, we requested a vote, and we couldn't get it. We informed them that no matter how long they delayed it, we were going to be there. They knew that I was due to come here to attend the building trades meeting, and I told them I was canceling that. That I was going to stay there, and I'd stay there till midnight on December 13th if that's what they wanted. Well, I guess they understood they weren't going to force us to walk out. So when we got there on Monday night, they were ready to vote. And they had a very simple agenda. We vote on 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 was the labor proposal. Number 2 was the industry proposal, and of course that was really unnecessary because it was practically identical with the so-called public proposal. And you have these pamphlets in front of you, and I'm sure you can see them, understand. Now the big difference in the proposals was in regard to the contracts, the ongoing contracts, and the so-called freeze money. Our proposal was that the contracts be honored in all of their terms, just as simple as that. But the public people come in and said that existing contracts will be allowed to operate except, and then they come in with a section known as 4C, and 4C is divided into 3 subsections, C1, C2, C3. C1 is that if you can get your freeze money if your prices were raised in anticipation of the increase. In other words, you could be a little bit of a mind reader maybe to get that one, but you could get it. Or if a wage agreement made after August 15th succeeded an agreement that expired and so forth, and where retroactivity was an established practice. And then is C3, such other criteria as the board may hereafter establish to remedy severe inequities. Well, by a 10-5 vote, they defeated our proposal, and then they went through the charade of defeating the employers' proposal, and then the employers voted with them, and they approved of the public proposal. And after that, we had about a half hour of discussion asking Mr. Weber how this would work, and it was very, very, very interesting. He was sitting there with the proposal in front of him, and they say, well, how how is this going to affect West Coast longshoremen? He says, they'll be taken care of under C2. How about the railroads? Oh, they'll be taken care of under C2. How about aerospace? Oh, they'll be taken care of under this, that, and the other. And he went on down the line. Railroads, aerospace, Me Too contracts, so on and so forth. And I finally says, well, hell, what about the little guys? You're taking care of all the big guys. Well, he said, we take care of anybody who fits into these particular qualifications. After, oh, and yes, and the Teamsters, they're taking care of everything. Freeze pay, and they got some contracts for a little bit over that 5.5. Maybe 3 times over something like that. But they're all right. They're going to be all the big unions are going to be taken care of, but not all the members of all the big unions. All the big unions have the big contracts, so on and so forth. Now, after Weber had gone through this for about a half hour, the judge issued a press statement. And he said, all wages are frozen except in the very, very few specific instances where they will be waived. And then the minutes come out. Nothing in the minutes. Nothing at all in the minutes about this. Well, we had some also other trouble with the minutes. We found out that we made several motions, and they were defeated. And the public members made some motions, and they were passed. And when the minutes come out the next day, the only motions recorded were the ones that were passed. They didn't even give us credit for getting a licking. Well, this was really an exercise in futility. And I can tell you there was a deliberate attempt here to divide the labor movement. Because on the Monday before the vote was taken, they sent an individual public member to see every labor member to try to tell that particular labor member not to worry, not to worry. And one of the public members came to me and said he could assure me, without putting it in the record, that they would not challenge any contract that was not over 8%. He said, we can't put that in, but I give you that assurance. In other words, he was going to give me a little under-the-table deal. Well, I can tell you about dividing the movement that I personally spared no effort from the very start of this whole maneuver to try to see to it that labor stayed together. I brought in the auto workers, the Teamsters, and I want to say they worked with us. They didn't buy this idea that they were going to be taken care of. In fact, they stated very, very simply that they didn't care who was taken care of. Unless everybody was taken care of, there was no deal. So here we are, face to face with some problems. Labor management relations in this nation have developed over the years along with the expansion and the development of this great economy we've got. And our system of collective bargaining has become part and parcel of the American economic way of life. And it's been developed over many years after some bitter struggles. And it has brought about an economy that is able to outproduce any other nation on earth. And this has been accomplished over the opposition of the right-wingers and surely of the left-wingers. And the cardinal principle of the bargaining mechanism is the commitment, both moral and legal, to honor the terms agreed upon without reservation of any kind. Put it more simply, when you make an agreement, you keep your word. You do not, under any circumstances, repudiate your commitment, and you expect the other party to do likewise. Without this, collective bargaining would be meaningless. It would be a sham and a snare. Now, the action of President Nixon and this pay board in nullifying contracts without even consulting the parties to these contracts threatened the future of collective bargaining. But more, They threaten the future of our whole economic system. If collective bargaining contracts, legal contracts, can be nullified by the terms of a presidential edict, then no contract is sacred. No mortgage, no bond, no payment on a business loan or installment credit or any other type of normal commercial commitment is safe. You know, the big business people like the idea of the sanctity of contracts. In fact, I haven't met anybody that don't like the sanctity. The old judge, he's for the sanctity of contracts. But he says there's a vital principle here involved. And I said, what the hell is the vital principle? He says, we got to go along with the president. In other words, the sanctity of contracts is not a principle, but we've got to go along with the president. That's the principle. Well, you know, there's a government agency to help in overseas private investment. They get private investment to try to expand overseas and perhaps help other peoples to develop a more modern society. And this is known as the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, a United States government agency. It's not private, it's private, and that's the title. It's a United States government agency. So the New York Times reports on Friday, November the 5th, that IT&T, International Telephone and Telegraph Company, said that they filed a claim with the Overseas Investment Corporation for the payment of $100 million because the government of Chile has run out on the contract with ITT. So they like their contracts honored. They believe in the sanctity of their contracts. Now, the trouble here is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation's only got $18 million in the till, and ITT wants $100 million, but Congress will most likely give them the rest. So we're really at a historic moment in the life of this nation. Whether good, for good or evil, only time will tell. This is the first time in the history of America that any president ever set out to control the economic life of the nation in peacetime. Now, it's no disrespect to the president to say that on the basis of his track record, we don't have very much confidence. He'd most likely be 20 to 1. And Arthur Burns, on the basis he's right, he'd be 60 to 1 on the morning line. But it's obvious that if the present program don't work, and there is no sure indication that it will work, the next step would be more stringent and oppressive measures that could destroy our American institutions. If phase 2 fails, political expediency demands a scapegoat. The man in the White House never says it's my fault. No politician ever says it's his fault. It demands a scapegoat, and we have no doubt as to who that scapegoat will be. Just as we had no explanation as to why the Nixon-Burns original economic game plan failed so miserably, there will be no explanation and no apology if phase 2 happens to fail. Harsher measures will be promulgated, surely directed, against the nation's workers. Well, and their unions, and we can expect anti-strike edicts and injunction and all the other harassment that have been the lot of labor in the authoritarian countries in recent history. There's something ironic about this business. Wall Street Journal the other day, there was this little quotation. A highly placed Nixon administration economist says, "We've got labor just where we want them now. They either help in making the program work or get blamed for its failure." Well, whether we help or don't help, if it fails, we get blamed anyway, I can assure you that. But it's ironic to note that in this instance, big business is applauding and promoting the president's crackdown on labor. And it might be well for the businessmen of our country who have traditionally and fundamentally in the past indicated their abhorrence for government control, to realize that the history of political domination of the means of production has in all cases eventually included business as well as labor. And it's also ironic and interesting to note the new affinity of Mr. Nixon for totalitarian regimes, from Peking to Moscow to Athens. The authoritarian mind in government trusts neither the people nor the free and voluntary institutions of the people. The impulse is to control, to direct, and to dictate. The only barriers to that impulse and the only bulwarks of freedom are our constitutional Bill of Rights, the existence of an effective opposition, our free private institutions, and the free spirit of the American people. Faced with these impediments, the inevitable tendency of power in such hands is to move to defame and to destroy them. In defending the rights and the freedom of working people, as they are constituted to do, the trade unions of America can expect to be the objects of such attention and the targets of this type of power. All the more so if labor is to stand alone in the struggle. So I say to you, we must therefore stand united as never before. For never before has so much depended upon the strength and unity of the family of labor. Thank you.